Hey, I'm Tyrene Martinson, and yesterday I read a short story called Shadow Magic, which I wrote first in 2016 and which was published for the first time by Aurora Wolf Magazine, which is an online publishing platform that used to pay amateur rates. It might pay professional rates now. I don't know. So I remember really being thankful when that story was published, and I was glad that people seemed to like it. And so that's part of the reason it ended up in the collection because I knew it was well liked, and I thought that people would still enjoy reading it in a book format. And it's why I shared it yesterday on this channel. So, what went into that story is my personal love of how light and shadow kind of play with each other on a sunny day. And I am a Christian, and I know that we often see God as light. I mean, Jesus does say he is the light of the world, and I love that. But I also really love the way that shadows and light kind of work together on sunny days to create these scenes of beauty. And I like how the shadows of tree branches will play across like the driveway, or how when you're maybe inside the house you get shadows from things coming in, and it's kind of fun to see how that works, and just the visual of that is beautiful to me. And because I live in the Pacific Northwest where it's very gray most of the winter, I really appreciate those type of blue sky days or sunny days where you get that play of light and shadow. So I wanted to write a story about that somehow for a really long time, and I didn't know how. I kept thinking, what could I do with shadows? What could I do with this idea of this play of light and shadow? What could I write that would be fun and interesting and include, maybe something fantastical. And finally, one day I sat down and I started writing this story about this young woman who gets called to break a curse at Shadow Keep. And she doesn't know that she has any magic. She doesn't know that her family has any magic. And it was one of those stories that I really wrote with without a plan, not much of a plan at all. That's pretty much all I had. Was there was a young woman. I knew that her father had died, and she didn't know there was any magic in her family, and her stepmother wasn't very nice to her. Very kind of a lot of standards, fairy tale type storytelling or fantasy storytelling type tropes in there, where there's the young teen whose parents are either gone or not nice to them, and so they don't have a good family to stick with, and they're ready to kind of launch out into the world on adventure. And so that's where I started that story from. And because I've written a lot of young adult work before, that seemed like a pretty good place to me to start. And the story kind of took off from there. The idea of these two horse riders who were coming from Shadowkeep, I had fun kind of playing around with how different they were. Daria's very straight laced, and Reggie's kind of laid back, and then the stepmother, of course, is just very dramatic and not very nice. And then we have Therese, and she isn't really sure about this whole thing, but she definitely wants away from her stepmother, right? And there's little pieces of the story that we don't get all of it because for a brief moment Reggie has her kind of entranced with his magic. So we don't see all the finishing up with the stepmother. And I remember thinking that, maybe I should spend more time with the stepmother, but then I thought, no, this is a short story and she's really not the most important person. And so I kind of liked having that segue where they just kind of move away from her and the adventure begins. And so Therese gets pulled into Shadowkeep, and it's not what she's expecting. It's so not what she's expecting. And at the end of the story, sorry, if you haven't listened to it yet, I'm going to give a little bit of a spoiler. It doesn't really end on a hard ending. Like, this is not the end of the road for Therese. You know that there are adventures ahead for her. And yes, I've had people ask me if I would consider writing more of a novel for it, but I really like how it ends. I love the fact that it ends on this moment of possibility. And even though the basic problem of the story is solved, we know that she has an adventure ahead of her still and a whole life ahead of her still to explore. And I kind of like stories that end that way. I like stories that leave space for the reader to imagine more about the characters. And I know that's not what everybody loves. So I may come back someday and write a story for Therese. But ironically, or maybe not so ironically, Therese is obviously a name that I like because I've used it more than once in my stories. And I have to be careful not to ever use it again because I have Therese from Shadow Magic and I have a very strong Therese figure in the Darkblade trilogy, and they're not the same person, okay? I guess they maybe could be, but they're really not the same person. And I didn't even realize I'd done it until, both were out into the world. And so it's kind of like, well, I have what I have out there. So anyway, Therese has to be a name that I'm not going to use again. But you may wonder why I didn't say Teresa instead of Therese. And it's because I really like the name Teresa. I have an aunt named Teresa who, when I was a kid, I highly admired. She was so cool. She was 11 years younger than my mom, and I just thought, she had it all together all the time, and I wanted to be like her when I grew up. And so I think that's why I kind of like the name Teresa. But I didn't want to use her name, so I used Therese. And I just have had fun playing with that, and I like the sound of the name. So that's kind of how all that ended up in there. The play of shadow and light, this coming of age adventure, the fact that the character still has places to go at the end of the story, even though the main story has been resolved, and the name, which obviously you can tell I still love if I keep accidentally using it. But I need to make myself a list of names not to use anymore because I've used them too many times. I do kind of fall into a rut. And I could talk more on that. I have a whole episode on my other podcast, which is called The Truth About Storytelling. That's all about character names, because you can get quite deep into what goes into creating character names, and it can be fun to play around with. But I have to admit, I often start as a discovery author. I'll just start something and just start writing like crazy. And that means that I'll just grab a name out of my imagination and throw it on the page. And then I'm kind of stuck with it because that character is that name. And so I try to kind of feed my brain more names on a regular basis. I will actually read the ending credits of movies because I'm looking for different names. I'm trying to familiarize my brain with different names, so that way hopefully the next time I get a big discovery idea and I start just spewing story out on the page, I will use a different name than I'm used to using. But I do know if I happen to name another character Therese, I'm going to have to change it to something else, because I feel like the Therese in Shadow Magic and the Therese in Darkblade trilogy are both very strong characters, and I want them to be the only Thereses that I write about for my whole life. So anyhow, I hope you enjoy this little behind the scenes episode, and I will see you around tomorrow, I think. I was originally going to do a 5th episode every week and talk about the themes in both the stories that I read this week. So I read Help Wanted Code Gray and I read Shadow Magic this week. And maybe they don't sound like they have anything in common because one's kind of a near future sci-fi and one's a fantasy story, but I think they do have things in common. So I may do another episode tomorrow, just a brief one to talk about theme. Thank you for joining me. This is Tyreen Martinson. This is Tyrene's Tales. And if you're interested in any of my work, go ahead and look me up online at online stores, and you can find my books all over the place. So thank you.